Well, hey everybody, Pastor Dean here, and it is Holy Week, which means the text for for today's video is our Easter passage. And for Easter, we've been going through, or for Lent, we've been going through the Gospel of Luke. And so Luke 24, 1 to 12 is the gospel passage for Easter Sunday. And so we're going to take a look at that and look at some of the particularities of Luke's resurrection story and how that may differ a little bit from Matthew, Mark, and John, but is very much in step with how Luke has portrayed Jesus and those who surround him throughout his entire gospel. So let's dive right in. This is Luke 24, verses 1 to 12. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and on the third day rise again?" Then they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. All right. So Luke's resurrection story begins, as all of them do, all right. Begins as all of them do on Easter morning, on very early in the morning, just after the Sabbath. So that phrase, "on the first day of the week at early dawn," it's this repetition of it being early in the morning and right after the Sabbath. So the word for week and Sabbath is the same thing, because Sabbath is tied to seven in the original language. So seven can mean a week. And in this particular case, it means, so it's like this day after the Sabbath, which the Sabbath is Saturday. So this first day of the week would be Sunday. And it's at early dawn. It's as soon as light begins to appear on the horizon. And that signals the end of the Sabbath, and it signals the ability for the women to go to the tomb to take the spices that they've gathered and go and finish the burial process for Jesus. Because remember, on Friday, which is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea gets the body of Jesus, and he has to wrap him up, and he has to quickly do that because the Sabbath is coming, and the Sabbath and the days begin at sundown. So as the sun is setting, then Joseph has to get Jesus' body into the tomb, because he can't do any work on the Sabbath, and neither can the women. So they have to wait for that Saturday to pass. And so as soon as light appears on Sunday morning, then they can go to the tomb. And if you if you go back into chapter 23, at the end of this is verse 49. All his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. So they watch Jesus die. And then beginning in verse 50, there was a good and righteous man named Joseph, who was a member of the council. He went to Pilate, asked for the body, took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid it in a rock-hewn tomb where no one had ever been laid. And it was the day of preparation, Friday, and the Sabbath was beginning. So it's almost sundown. the women who had come with him, with Jesus from Galilee, followed, and they saw the tomb, and they saw how his body was laid. So they saw Joseph put Jesus' body in the tomb. So they knew where it was. They knew that Jesus had gone in there. And so they knew where they needed to go on Sunday morning. And so they returned, presumably to their home, and prepared spices and ointments. So they are the Jewish burial customs had ointments and spices and these linen cloths that were wrapped around the body to do a couple of things. One is to honor the dead, but also because of the hot and humid climate in the Middle East, in this particular region, there would have been the decomposition would have started happening quickly, and so the spices and the ointments and the aromatics and things like that are meant to diffuse the smell of the body decomposing. It's kind of gross, I get it, but it's the reality of death. So they have these spices and these ointments ready to go because Joseph had to act quickly. And so the end of verse 56 in chapter 23 says, on the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandments. So they're going to keep the commandments. They're going to stay faithful to that. And so the very next time that they have opportunity to do anything is at first light on Sunday morning. So first day of the week, chapter 24, verse 1. On the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb. They knew where it was, so they could go there. And they take the spices that they had prepared. Again, back at the end of 23. And they go expecting not only the stone to be in place in front of the tomb, but also Jesus' body to be there. They go expecting that. They go with the spices and with the ointments, going to finish the burial process for Jesus. But that's not what they find. They find the stone rolled away from the tomb. And when they go in, they don't find his body there. And so that's verses 2 and 3, verses 4. While they were perplexed, while they're confused, while they were trying to figure out what has just happened, two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. So these bright white, almost gleaming clothes stand right next to them. And they are terrified. They're scared out of their wits. They don't know what in the world is happening. So the only thing they do is they bow their faces to the ground. They humble themselves. They cower basically in fear and terror. So the men say to these women, why do you look for the living among the dead? And they go on to say, he is not here, but has risen. So they realize that what the women have come to do is to anoint Jesus and finish that burial process. They have come looking for the dead, where the dead are supposed to be. And they ask, why are you looking for the living, those who are alive, those who have life breath in them, among those who do not have life breath? And so they're confused because they thought that Jesus was dead. And that's what they came to expect. And that's what they came to do, is to see the dead, to see Jesus' body, to anoint him to finalize his burial process. And yet these two men, which is Luke's way of saying angels, say to him, why do you look for the living among the dead? So they're telling the women that Jesus is alive. He is risen, they say. And then they go on in verse 6. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again. Now, it's not in the form of a question. They're making the statement because that's what Jesus said in 9:22 and in other places along the way. Jesus said to them, I will be handed over to sinners, and they will kill me, and on the third day I will rise. Now, notice how the men utilize, and these angels utilize the word crucify. says, hand it over to sinners, be crucified, and on the third day rise again. So they're referencing the fact that that he was crucified instead of just being killed. So they're specific about how Jesus died. So they say, don't you remember? You remember that he said this. And when they say this, when the angels say this to the women, they remember. There's verse 8. Then they remembered his words. And then returning from the tomb, they told all of this to the 11 and to all the rest. So they leave the tomb and they go find the disciples and all the others who were gathered around them, and they tell them what they've just experienced, what they've just seen. The fact that they went to the tomb expecting to anoint Jesus' body. They find that the tomb is empty, that his body isn't there. These two men come, tell him that Jesus is alive, that he is risen, he's not there, and reminded them, hey, Jesus said this was going to happen. And they remember, and they go and tell the story. Now, it's not until this point, as we begin verse 10, that the women are identified. But back up further, you can see that it's not even clear. It's only clear in the original language because there's a bunch of pronouns in here that it's actually women that are at the tomb. So it says on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. It's feminine in the original language, taking the spices that they, in feminine, had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. Look at all these pronouns. So it's not clear, number one, who is there. But in the original language, you can see that it's someone who's female, or multiple women who are female. And while they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men. So now there's a change in gender to specify these people who show up in dazzling clothes, that it's men. And they say to the women, but verse 5, actually in Greek, it's still they, but it's feminine. So the NRSV has done us a favor here to say that these are women, and that the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But again, the word is they there, but it's masculine. In the second half of verse 5, they, the men, said to them, the women, why do you look for the living among the dead? So again, there's these pronouns here, and it's just, this is just a little bit of nerd in me that says that these things are obvious in the original language, because you can see that there's gender attached to these pronouns, and it misses in English, but that's okay. Our translators will do that work for us into English. So the women are terrified. The men say to them, to the women, why do you look for a living among the dead? But it isn't until verse 10 that we hear who it is that's actually there at the tomb. So it's Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women. So there's three specific women, and then other women who tell all of this to the apostles. Now, notice that they tell it to the 11. Typically, we think about the 12. But by this time, Judas is apart from them. But Luke doesn't tell us what happens to Judas until we get to the book of Acts. But that's another story. So it's the 11, and then all the others, it says, and all the rest. So there are already other people with the 11. So there's these three women plus the other women that are with them. So, probably half a dozen, maybe more women that go to the tomb, and they see this happen. They hear these words from these two men in dazzling clothes, these angels, and they go back to the 11 disciples and all of those who are gathered, and they tell the story. They tell the story that there is an empty tomb, that Jesus is alive. And verse 11 says, these words seem to them, that's the disciples, the apostles, and those with them, an idle tale. Foolishness is another way to translate that word. And they did not believe them. Now, there's some cultural things that are happening here that get hidden, that get sort of scooped over in our 21st century world, because in this culture, women's testimony, the testimony of a woman, was not accepted in court. So there was this sense that these women didn't have any standing to proclaim truth about what they'd seen in a court of law, and it wouldn't have held up against a man's testimony. Now, when you read all 4 gospel accounts of the resurrection, it's women who are the first to proclaim and see the resurrected Jesus, to proclaim him and to make that story known. This is significant because and it leads to, because it happens in all 4 gospels, it's this connected piece in Jesus's story that leads us to know that that the gospel writers didn't shape this narrative to suit their own needs, but the gospel writers captured it the way that it happened. Because if they wanted to suit their own needs, they wouldn't have had women be the ones who bear witness. And culturally, it wouldn't have made sense. Culturally, they would have had a man, maybe Peter, maybe John, maybe James or somebody like that, one of the higher ups, make the testimony, because then it would have stood the test of time. It would have held weight with those in the immediate context. But instead, all 4 gospel writers show that it's the women who go first. It's the women who share the news first. And this adds to the veracity of the resurrection accounts. Now, if you read all 4 gospel accounts of the resurrection, which I recommend that you do, then you'll see that they all have a different flavor. They all have a different way of doing it. Matthew's really dramatic. There's an earthquake, a stone rolls away, and there's guards that fall over. It's just they all have their ways of describing the way that the resurrection happens. And the cool thing is that because we have 4 accounts of the resurrection, and we have these authors that are telling us about how Jesus was resurrected. I mean, the fact that the fact is that the resurrection is such a powerful and profound moment in history. It's the foundational moment in history that changes everything. Then it makes sense that as we look at it, as those who experienced it looked at it and remembered it and wrote it down, then it's going to look a little different for each of them. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way that each of the authors saw it and captured it and wrote it down and passed it on. So whether it happened with an earthquake, or whether it was already gone, the stone was already rolled away, or whether there were guards, or no guards, or angels, or men, or 1 or 2, however that goes along, the basic premise is the same, is that Jesus wasn't there, that Jesus had been resurrected, that Jesus was alive, that looking for the living among the dead was the wrong place to look for Jesus. It was the wrong way of going about it. And ultimately, what's supposed to happen is that as these women experienced the empty tomb, they were to then go and tell others. Now, some gospels like Mark or Matthew says that there were specific instructions given to the women, that they were to go back to to the disciples and share. John has specific instructions as well. And but here in Luke, there are no specific instructions from the angels to the women. Look again. It says, remember how he told you, this verse 6, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified on the third day and rise again. Then they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to the rest. Notice there's no specific instructions. There's no go tell Peter and his compatriots, go tell Jesus's brothers, go tell anybody. It's the women spontaneously going, we got to go tell people. We got to go. So they leave the tomb and they go and they find the 11 and those who were gathered with them, and they share this story. Now, unfortunately, it gets at first glance, at first gloss, it gets ignored as an idle tale, like they don't believe it. But Peter is the exception. Peter, in verse 12, got up. He hears the women tell this story. He hears them tell about Jesus not being there, the stone being rolled away, these two men in dazzling clothes. He hears that story and he goes. He goes to the tomb. He runs to the tomb. And he stoops and he looks in and he saw the linen cloths by themselves. He sees that there's no body. He sees the linen cloths lying by themselves. He sees the stone rolled away because he's able to stoop and look in. And then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't go back to the other 10 and those gathered with them and say they were right. No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't go and confirm what it is the women said. He goes home amazed. This idea of perhaps being of wondering and questioning and looking at what is it that is happening here. So amazed in the original language is to wonder at, marvel at, admire, be astonished, and even being out of one's senses, not really understanding what it is that is taking place in this moment. And so that's Peter's response to the resurrection. It's not until verse 45 when he meets the resurrected Jesus and Jesus tells him, hey, you remember I told you these things? That then he understands. So the women respond first. The women see the empty tomb. They see the rolled away stone. They see that there's no body in that tomb. They see the linen cloths. They see these two men in bright angel clothes. And they say, remember, and they remember, and they go and tell the story. See, the thing about Easter, the thing about the resurrection story is that, yes, it changes everything. I mean, our entire world shifted in Jesus's resurrection, in his death and resurrection. Just think about the calendar. This is the moment where everything changes. We go from BC to AD. We go from before Christ to Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. This is the shift point of our entire world, of our entire history. But we don't stay stuck in the empty tomb. You see, Luke leaves the ending of the gospel, of his gospel, sort of in limbo. There's unanswered questions that are left at the end of the Gospel of Luke, which get picked up, tied together in the opening chapters of the book of Acts. And we've been through that. We've walked through the book of Acts. But what happens is that the women don't stay stuck at the tomb. They remember. And they go and they tell. They tell the story of Jesus. They go back to the 11 and say, what he said was true. He said he was going to be killed. He said he was going to rise again, and he did. And initially, the men don't believe it. Initially, they still remain in fear. The disciples, particularly in Luke, have a few have some time, because immediately following the resurrection story in the Gospel of Luke, there's the road to Emmaus story, where Jesus later that day, that Sunday, talks to Cleopas and his friend who are walking from Emmaus to Jerusalem, or from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and they meet the resurrected Jesus, and they don't recognize him. They don't. He remains under the radar as he's meeting with them, and it's not until he is revealed to them in the breaking of the bread that they see who he is, and we're not our. They say their eyes were open and they recognized him and he vanished. Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? That's verse 32. They realize who it is. And so then they get up and they go and they return to Jerusalem. They find the 11 and their companions, and the Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon Peter. They told what had happened along the road and how he made known to them in the breaking of the bread. And then Jesus shows up to the disciples, to all of them, and he says he has fish. He's asking what they're eating, and he has some fish. He eats. They think he's a ghost. He proves them wrong, and then he says in verse 44, "Then he said to them, These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Messiah is to suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem." So he opens their minds so that they can understand. The women heard the angel voices saying, "Remember what he said?" They remember and they go proclaim. And that happens early on that first Easter morning, that first resurrection day. So the women are able to see that the tomb is empty. They're able to hear and remember what Jesus said, and then they're able to go and proclaim that good news. And the world has never been the same. Our lives have never been the same. And all of history changed because of this. So I invite you, I invite your groups to ponder and reflect on the power of the resurrection and the calling that each of us have, not to stay right here and marvel at in amazement at the empty tomb like Peter, but to take the story of the resurrected Jesus, go out into our world and share that with our friends and our family, with our loved ones, with our neighbors, with the world. That's the real power of the resurrection, is that it shifts in us what it is that we are to do, and it shapes us, and it causes us to continue to draw closer to Christ, and continues to call us to help share that good news with those who are around us. That's the power of the resurrection. Yes, it gives us new life, but that new life is not just to be celebrated and thank God that we have new life. Yes, we thank God we have new life, but it's also to say new life is possible each and every day for all of us. That new life in Christ, and that new life in Christ draws us closer, draws us towards him, and draws us closer, as John Wesley would say, towards perfection. It's a sanctification process that begins in this moment. So I hope that's helpful for you. I hope that your conversations on Easter Sunday are fantastic. And in the week after, I pray that you continue to share the love of Jesus with those who are in your groups and those in your community. I pray that your families have a wonderful opportunity to worship and share together on this Holy Week in Easter, and during the whole season of Easter, because Easter is not a day; it's a season that that includes the Ascension in 40 days and also Pentecost on the 50th day after Easter, and we'll get there. We'll talk about that too. So next Sunday, the 24th, is our Rise Against Hunger meal packaging event, and so we won't have a formal worship service. I'll share a few thoughts about the post-resurrection church and how that impacts us and why it impacts what we're doing that particular day. And then we're going to jump back into the Gospel of Mark, and we'll begin in chapter 5 with so the video next week will be about Mark chapter 5, and we'll go from there. So if you have any questions, feel free to give me a shout. And I look forward to seeing you either on Maundy Thursday or Good Friday and or Easter Sunday morning at 7, 9, or 11. Again, I hope you have a fantastic week and blessings to you. Let me know if I can do anything for you. Appreciate you. Take care.